Hello and welcome to Writing Essentials with Mrs. Benson. Today we're going to be talking about elements of a narrative, and in particular we're going to use a mentor text in order to discuss several different important elements of a narrative. So let's jump in. Um, you might be asking yourself, how do I write a narrative? Okay, I get the idea it's a story, but I don't know where to start. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what a good narrative looks like. And so for today's video, I am providing you an example. Reading a mentor text allows you to see good writing at work. Then you can emulate stylistic qualities that you see in the example in your own writing. You see what writers do, and then you do well, and then you try to do these things yourself. This is not cheating or copying because you're telling your own story. So you're not taking the plot, and copying the plot of this mentor text, but you're copying stylistic choices. And that's totally fair game. So let's check one out, written by yours truly, and see what we can learn. So here's a sample autobiographical narrative written by Mrs. Benson, myself, and this is our mentor text that we're going to read together today. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit and allow us to see it, see how it's in that nice MLA format. Okay, so I'm going to just read it top to bottom, and then at the end, we'll talk about some of the very specific narrative elements that I want to emphasize and maybe encourage you to try to emulate in your own writing. Here we go. A mystery cut short. How could you do this? My eyes drifted down to my feet, noticing my white keds and the faded purple socks folded over once that matched my entirely purple outfit. What had I done wrong? What rule did I break? How could you do this? This time she would not accept my silent contemplation as an answer. I don't know. I was just playing, I returned in the small, subdued tones of a 4-year-old facing the grand jury. Tears collected in my eyelids like a pool of rain on top of an awning until eventually they streamed down my cheek. Then they continued to roll down to the edge of my chin before finally free falling to the linoleum floor below. I rubbed my right eye with the palm of my right hand and drew breath in through my nose desperately and intermittently between my distraught sobs. When I went to look into my mother's eyes for comfort and understanding, I could only see her frustrated eyes looking in the direction of my left ear. She ran her fingers through my hair like a rake combing soil. She shook her head in disbelief. I'm not mad. Just tell me what went through your mind. Why would you cut off your hair? The prosecution questioned the defendant. Because the defendant stuttered in fear. Sarah, you have a huge hunk of hair missing from the left side of your head. You would have no hair left if I hadn't caught you mid-snip in the bathroom. Why did you do it? In hopes of escaping with a hung jury, I again looked to the floor to evade the perennial power of a mother's stare. Nothing could combat its strength and accuracy. I turned my head away and then noticed my reflection in the brown and beige toned microwave sitting on the counter to my right. At that moment, I realized what I had done. Faintly, as I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass, I could see a large portion of my already thin and short sand-colored hair missing, cut to just above my ear on the left side. If only I had contemplated the long-lasting consequences of taking the pair of dull-tipped, red-handled scissors, pulling strands of my hair away from my head and cutting portions of it several times, and then placing pieces of it in select cabinets and corners of our home. At the time, it all seemed so rational. Detective Ray needed to collect evidence in order to convict the loathsomely unpleasant criminal performing the many inimical acts in the neighborhood. What better way to convict a crook than with evidence, hair left at the scene of the crime? After 10 minutes of continued interrogation, I finally came clean. Knowing the innocence and the blunders of a child at play, my mother held me tightly and explained the repercussions of an imagination untamed. Following a second onslaught of tears, now from shame and embarrassment, I stood with my now pink tinted pizza eyes and pressed both hands hard against the side of my head to try and cover the hole. With no resolution in sight, I refused to drop them and face the large crater in my head's eastern hemisphere. But not for long, for Mom, a detective with an impeccable record, solver of all mysteries known to man, and first grade girl, gently took my hands down and escorted me to the bathroom. Within minutes, she magnanimously ensconced the missing hair with a carefully selected side part and poodle hair clip. A wide, bright smile, minus the two front teeth, erupted from my mouth. Calamity now evaded, peace finally restored. My perpetual ability to keep myself entertained while the rain pounded the concrete streets outside, and my untimely imagination mixed with, in all probability, the wondrous exploits of Scooby Doo and his gang, all culminated in one 6-year-old girl devoid of a fistful of hair and one confused mother with the task of hiding the ridiculous hole. Though cut short by intelligence from administration, Detective Ray's quest for a crime free King Street would continue. Dun dun dun. The end. Little side tip, my maiden name, last name is Ray. So that's why there's a Ray in there for Detective Ray and not Detective Benson. I wasn't a Benson yet. So we're just going to end this video by talking about a few elements of this narrative that I think you might want to consider asking yourself, do I want to do this? Would this make my narrative writing better? This isn't to say you have to do it. This is just to give you some awareness, some very specific details about what good writing, good narrative writing typically looks like, can look like, and then you can decide if you want to integrate it or not. The first thing I just wanted to talk about is the opening. You want to have an engaging start to your narrative so that people want to keep reading. So I started in the middle. I started with, how could you do this? I started with my mom catching me having committed this crime, rather than starting with, one day I decided to cut my hair. That could have very easily been my start if I went in a very linear fashion of the beginning, middle, and end chronologically, right? But I wanted to do something different. I wanted to grab my reader's attention, make them wonder what happened, make them kind of guess at the beginning, and then provide the beginning later. So it wasn't until, 2/3 of the way through the narrative that I actually explained what had happened in the beginning. So restructuring, being comfortable with manipulating my storyboard was a way for me to make the story more engaging and to start with a much more dynamic opening. I'd also like you to consider verbs. There will be a video about verb choices that you can elect to watch later, but verb choices are a really powerful way of making your writing sound more active and engaging and interesting. And the biggest tip I can give you for that is to try to avoid as best you can what are called linking verbs. And again, you can watch this video to get into that, but your was's and your were's, as long as you're in past tense, they're not as dynamic as action verbs, where I like to keep the reader engaged because of the interest of the language. So instead of my eyes were looking down, I say my eyes drifted down. Okay. Instead of I was saying or I did say, I returned. Tears collected, not tears were in my eyelids. Tears collected in my eyelids. Okay. So giving those strong active verbs make the writing a little more dynamic and interesting. Sorry for the scrolling around there. And now I just wanted to spend one moment talking about figurative language. So, figurative language is when we go beyond the literal. We're in the land of the figurative. So, this is when I can use language that in reality would mean one thing, but if I think on a metaphoric level, a figurative level, I can add more depth and interest to the writing. So, our best way to integrate figurative language is through similes and metaphors. So, you might have noticed that there were some similes and metaphors in this narrative. I said that the tears collected in my eyelids like a pool of rain on top of an awning. And then I said my mom combed her fingers through my hair like a rake combing soil. Okay, so those similes add more interest. I could just say she put her fingers through my hair, done. But by saying like a rake combing soil, it adds more personality, it adds more dynamics, it adds more interest, it makes the story more interesting. Then there's also, I tried to put in some metaphoric language in the narrative. My longest or my most extended use of that, if you will, an extended metaphor, would be this idea that I was a defendant, my mom was the prosecution or the judge, and that we were in some kind of like courtroom drama, even though it was just a little kid talking to her mom. So I have, the prosecution questioned the defendant stuttered in fear. I said something like, escaping with a hung jury. So I kind of stuck with that metaphor for a little while to heighten the drama. No, this was not a courtroom experience, literally, but figuratively, in that moment, I felt the magnitude of making my mom upset. And I wanted to compare that feeling to maybe a defendant being on trial. I also talked about, covering the crater in my head. I don't have a literal hole, but there's a hole of hair. And I talked about my pink tinted pizza eyes. My family called me pizza eyes when I was a kid, to be honest, because my eyes were always really big and wide open. So, but pizza eyes is metaphoric. They're not literally pizza, right? So the idea is you color your story more when you use figurative language. So I would encourage you to think about where you can put in a simile or metaphor here and there. There's another video about descriptive details, so I'm not going to give a lot, but you need to choose your moments where you can be more descriptive. So if we go back to the mentor text, I spent time describing my white Keds and my faded purple socks folded over once. Those aren't hugely significant details to the actual understanding of the story, but they provide images for the story so that you in your mind can have a better picture of the 6-year-old Mrs. Benson rather than the picture of who you see today. And I thought it was important to describe my hair. I thought it was important to describe the scissors. I thought it was important to describe the environment. So I have the linoleum floor, my reflection in the microwave. Notice I didn't describe my mom. I didn't give any really big details about what she looked like. I gave a lot of details about her being frustrated and the tone of her voice, but I didn't spend the time describing her physical appearance. Those are choices you make. You can't describe every little thing in a 2-page narrative, right? Or even a 3-page narrative or a 10-page narrative. You have to be judicious and decide what makes more sense for me to spend time on. It was important for me to describe my hair because the hair played a big key role in the story. Last but not least, notice the MLA format. When you're producing writing for your English classes and your social science classes for school, you want to use MLA format. So you want your pagination in the heading so that every time you go to a new page, the page number switches. You want to make sure you do your name, the teacher name, the class name, and then the date. The date has no commas whatsoever. It's the number first, then the month, and then the year. I'll finally finished with one added component, just in case you didn't notice. I love to think of framing my stories. That means there's going to be an element in the beginning that I hearken back to at the end. This provides subconsciously for your reader a sense of closure. And that closure, even if the reader didn't pick up on it, that closure gives this little like warm, fuzzy, feel good feeling, even if the reader doesn't really understand where it came from. So this is kind of a sophisticated, quick and easy writer's trick for making your writing really sing by the time your reader reaches the end. And this is what I do. I connect something at the beginning to something at the very end. So my something at the beginning is my title. I titled my story A Mystery Cut Short. And you can now know why I did that. This is a story about cutting my hair. So I used kind of that in a cheekish way to say a mystery cut short. Then at the end of my narrative, now remember that title's before you even know what the story is about. So that's kind of like this subliminal hint of what's to come. Then at the very end of my narrative, you might not have caught it, but I said, though cut short by intelligence from administration, Detective Ray's quest for a crime-free King Street would continue. I lived on King Street. There we have it, cut short, brought forward again. I'm not saying you have to use the literal repetition of words in order to give that sense of closure, but if you hearken back to something that you introduced, a slight wording, a slight metaphor, a slight something that you introduced at the beginning or in your title, and then you bring the reader back to it, even if he doesn't realize it overtly, he will have a better sense of closure. So I like to call that framing your narrative. It gives a sense of completion and sort of that sense of finality and closure that would be great when we're reading a story, right? To have a feeling of, ooh, that was a good story. That felt good. That felt like a clean ending or something that didn't leave any loose ends. So that was our mentor text. I hope you got some great ideas for some things that you can do in your narrative to make it more engaging, more dynamic, fun to read, and something that your readers will really appreciate. Take care.